Hi, I think it's with the last portion of the main program. So we have the last word on everything, which is a position of great power that we will wear that crown, that heavy crown, well. But also maybe a great opportunity to thank everyone for coming and for all the volunteers who put so much hard work into this and all the organizers. So we have a very small subject, sports and fiction. And I'm Megan Abbott, and everyone, when they first speak, can maybe introduce themselves just because we don't have that much time and we have a big panel. But I thought I'd just start us off sort of as a backward way of getting into why fiction and sports may be such a perfect marriage, or at least a robust one. Maybe we could all talk a little bit about how we first came to write about it imaginatively. I know some of you wrote about it in a nonfiction capacity first before fiction, and some came at it from that point of view. I know for me, as a non-athlete, I have a book about competitive cheer and a book about elite gymnastics. People often ask me, very foolishly, if I competed as a cheerleader or a gymnast, which I did not. And for me, it was always I was so dazzled by what seemed to me that control, especially female athletes, the control and mastery over their body that I never felt. It's an often tortured relationship that athletes have with their body, of course, but to me, there was something that I had felt I had no access to, and I wanted to get behind that and the fearlessness of these women and get under that skin. So for me, it was very personal when it started, but I wonder if whoever would you like to start since you're right next to me?
Okay. Hi, I'm Jane Leavy, and I've written one sports novel. It's, as many of you know from listening to me previously, it's dirty, and it's called
Really, really funny.
Yeah. And I wrote it after leaving the Washington Post, where I was a sports writer for 12 years. And Squeeze Play is really the story of women in the locker room as it had evolved in the first 10, 12 years after we were allowed in and went knocking on the door. And the reason I wrote it was that in those days, and this is an indice of how much has changed in journalism and in our culture, I couldn't tell the truth in the Washington Post. I couldn't write, in fact, what happened to me with Mickey Mantle, for example. So I had to go to fiction, and the fiction, therefore, was much more accurate and truthful. Yes, they did microwave a cat, things like that. Things that I couldn't write in the Post, I was able to write about and make fun of in fiction.
Are we going to go in order?
Yeah, let's start.
Well, I talked a little bit yesterday about my personal connections to baseball, so I won't go over my mother and my brother again. But I will say that it was an incredible experience to be writing kind of a baseball novel, and that's because it's the first thing I've ever done that's kind of a genre novel, and it was incredibly liberating to realize, like, oh, there's going to be a big game at the end. It's like just having that piece in place before, from the get-go, just made writing it a lot easier. I mean, I did write this book very quickly, as I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but part of that was where I was in my life, but part of it was having having the narrative sort of semi-structured from the get-go. And it really made me understand why people won't write genre, because just like you, in a funny kind of way, having that there made me that much looser. It made me it was very liberating, and for me it was quite an interesting writing experience.
Well, from about 7th grade onward till I graduated from high school, I was an athlete, and I loved being athletic. In high school, I was on the basketball team and the field hockey team and the volleyball team. I did a lot of running, and I think that some of the happiest times in my life, when I look back through the decades now, I can sort of remember these really wonderful interludes, particularly team sports. I don't know whether people have talked much about the excitement. That's just a visceral thrill and great happiness of being on a team, even if you're not doing that well. You're playing basketball, you're sharing the experience, which is intense. and very exciting, so that there's a feeling of joy. So in writing about sports, which I have not done much about in fiction, in the last section of my novel, A Book of American Martyrs, there's a girl boxer, and she was a girl. She's about 17, 18, 19 when she starts fighting professionally. And I was sort of reliving that. And I think people don't maybe understand that when you're with other, sports is about other people. And Dawn, when she gets in the ring, she's looking at this other boxer, and she's enthralled. You can sort of tell she's falling in love with this other boxer. She doesn't know that. She's totally infatuated and enthralled, and she gets hit and hurt because of that. So these feelings that we don't have any place to put, I think are exercised and are just thrilling in sports. And then even losing, if it's with a team, you're sort of losing together. It's not like an isolated individual who crawls off, like maybe like a writer. You get a bad review, you just sort of feel very isolated and individual. The team is a different experience.
Okay, I'm Lionel Shriver. I've written 3 novels which at least involve sports. And by contrast, I'm not at all interested in group activities of any kind. That includes team sports. I am not a team player. Neither are my characters. And therefore, I'm mostly interested in sports that are one-on-one. In the first novel that had some sports content, or a lot actually, called Double Fault, I had 2 young people one of whom has always wanted to be a professional tennis player, and the other, the man who picks it up almost on the fly, but is one of those irritating people who's good at everything. So, and they get married. And I was looking for an expression of something I'd picked up in my own relationship as well as other people's, of the problem with the 2-career marriage, and the fact that you're not necessarily just a team, but you can get into a very competitive relationship. And that's most intense when you do the same thing for a living. Even more intense, I thought, if you're involved in a sport that actually ranks you by number. So there would be no way to evade who was doing better than whom. Deadly. And indeed, as I got into the novel, so it proved. But in that instance, I was coming at the material from the perspective of personal amateur enthusiasm. I have, since I was about 8 years old, been a fanatical and really crummy tennis player. And but what I could bring to the book was a love of the game. And actually, in the novel, that is what becomes at risk. And by the end, not to ruin everything for you, but by the end, the protagonist has not only lost her husband, but in some ways, the real love of her life, which is tennis. And I think when listening to Michael Mushaw talk about tennis yesterday, it made me realize how common this must be on the circuit. That people get into tennis sometimes because they're good at it and they learn to love it, but it becomes so grueling that there is no love for the sport at the end of it. I've also written a book that concerns snooker, which, according to Jeff Dyer, is not a sport because you can smoke during it. And I needed something for a love interest to do in Britain that for an American would be very British and rather exotic. And snooker is quite its own world. And in that case, I was approaching the sport not from amateur enthusiasm, but mostly from a kind of external amateur admiration. These are people doing something that I have no idea how to do it, much like Megan. And it's like, and therefore it wasn't written about from the perspective of the player. I think that was instinctive because I don't know what it's about. So the reader watches. And I won't go into it in any length because I did a whole solo event on it earlier in the seminar. But my new book is about the cult of exercise, and that is on an amateur level. That's for the punters, as they say in the UK. And what interests me in some ways about the new enthusiasm for athleticism among the hoi polloi is that it doesn't seem to involve being good at anything, right?
Well, yeah.
It almost excludes sport as we understand it.
Right, and it's weirdly dovetails with a self-care thing now that's
Yes.
sort of so appalling. No offense to self-care enthusiasts, but it is become its own cult. But it sounds like we're talking about like 3 different ways to approach it, which is a love of the sport, either having done the sport or just as a fan, and then there's the desire to enter the world of that sport because of the fascinations it brings as this sort of subculture, and then how sports is such a useful metaphor. So it's so useful for writers. I think for me with cheer, the top girl, the girl at the top of the pyramid is, this is the key spot. It's the star shot and the competition to get there and how much your body type rules it. So it sort of gives you all these things to write about sports. But to go back to something Gish was saying about how as a genre, it gives you a structure. I was reading this piece this morning in The Atlantic that came out when the book The Art of Fielding, which some of you do know that book, came out a few years ago. Well, now it's many years ago. But and there was a piece about why there are so few sports novels, and the editor of the book was talking. Eventually he came around, but when he first started to read the manuscript, this long manuscript, it's a really long book, he's like, why did Chad Harbach waste all these years writing a book about baseball? And the question came up is there a snobbery within literary fiction about writing about sports? And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, a snobbery against writing about sports.
Yes, that it's not
I don't know about that. I don't know if
serious
that's the right article. I mean, I'm sorry, I haven't read the article.
Yeah, no, but
like-
just do you feel
but-
that it's not taken as seriously? And I don't mean just anybody can jump in on this, but is there some
Yes.
kind of,
Well,
you do?
Well,
Okay.
Time out. Okay, let me say, I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts, so the fact that I haven't read the article will not stop me from having an opinion about it.
Good, okay. Moreover, I did not complete the article, and
And I feel like I'm about to come to blows with my dear friend Jane Levy as well. No. I mean, so many great writers have written with such distinction about baseball that I think it's kind of intimidating. So, you're talking about, Philip Roth, John Updike, actually, obviously, Roger Angel, Bernard Malamud. I mean, there's a lot of very, very, very distinguished writing out there. So I think I would say the opposite, which is a little bit intimidating.
is it baseball alone, though? Does that, but that
Well, it's not. It's funny, but you're right. It does tend to be about baseball, but it's not the baseball novel, and that's exactly what I'm getting to. This, but that's part of the snobbery. There is the snobbery against genre, and just what I was sort of saying. As I was feeling, just like how fun it was and how easy it was in a way to have a little bit of formula. Now, obviously, as a literary writer, that's I need to.
Which is a
take
genre,
enormous license with that. I mean, that's
yeah.
my job.
Yeah.
That if anybody should pick this up and sort of say, "Oh, well, this is just like a baseball novel," I mean, obviously, I would not be able to sit here. That snobbery against genre. It's not just baseball. It's horror,
crime novels.
crime novels, any kind of genre. We feel does not. We feel that there's a formula. And we feel it's not an expression of our authenticity, and so it's almost like, look, you can get into a lot of trouble trying to draw that line between high and low culture, but in some fundamental way, the way it has evolved in the West, and that's an important caveat, in the West, we define art as something that is an expression of our authentic selves. We in the West invented those selves relatively recently. It's very much a modern Western invention. But in any case, even though we can see that there are many kind of what we would think of genre painters, for instance, who were very great. Giotto, for example. What about, all those Madonna and Childs, you would say, well, that's like a genre. And yet we can also see that there were some very, very, very great painters within that genre. But in the West today, there is a snobbery against it, yes.
I also think that there's an element of insecurity in that snobbery, as there often is with snobbery.
Yes.
Because I've been to a crime writing convention, freakishly. I have one book that qualified. And these people sell scads more books than we do. I mean, my God, my signing queue, I was trying to keep the 5 people in conversation and drawing them little pictures. And the guy next to me, the queue was wrapped around the block. So, and I think that there's something about literary fiction that has trouble defining itself, which increases that sense of insecurity. In some ways, literary fiction is what's left when genre cleans up all the readership. Then there's the literary fiction. And I'm not sure that being uncategorizable is a big selling point.
Well,
I actually think that sports lends itself not just to narrative nonfiction, but to fiction, because there's always a conflict, and there's always a beginning.
And always a goal.
And a beginning, and a middle, and an end.
One of the only fiction tips I've ever heard that actually sounded kind of useful was make your protagonist want something. And in sports, they always want something, and it's not subtle.
And there's always
They want to win.
Yeah, I think
and in
there's
addition,
I'm sorry. I think there's a good reason why there's a preponderance of baseball novels, which is that baseball runs at a pace that allows for imagination. The thing that people of a certain age today hate about baseball, that there are ellipses and stops in the action, is for a writer perfection, because it leaves room to imagine and to think and to write a good sentence.
Yeah, and yet the reader is still engaged. I will say also, the game itself, of course, because it observes the great dramatic unities that were laid down by Aristotle, right? The unities of time and place and action. In itself, it is drama itself. And because there is so much drama, we know that we can get the reader to the end, and we can also relax a little bit, give them some space. We don't worry that they're going to stop reading.
And then the genres are also infused with a sense of investment in a character. Like we care about a person, therefore we care about the narrative. I think writing about sports, one could easily write about medicine or the academic world, that seems almost secondary to dealing with characters. And genres are traditional. The genre of tragedy, for instance, is distinct from the genre of comedy. I don't think one is elevated necessarily above the other. And when you're working with suspense or psychological novels that have structure like a form, there's an unwritten contract with the reader that things will be summed up and explained to some extent in the final chapter, which with literary fiction, there's supposedly not that contract. You can read all the way through to the end and say, what? It's not resolved, so that's why literary fiction, as Lionel was saying, it may be something that's sort of left over from the other genres.
Well, we want it's true that I think that, in popular literature, people want an answer. Yeah. And it is our job actually to frustrate, as literary people, to kind of frustrate that. I think, James Wood, the critic, has written a lot about, that literary fiction should be bottomless. At least it's interesting that Louisa was talking about ineffability. We're interested in these qualities that are not so cut and dry. And that will lead to, frustration of what most people want.
Although I think you can sometimes deliver an answer of sorts.
Of course.
But what you need to do is give people not the answer they were expecting or even wanting. It has to be different. Right. It has to be a surprise. And sometimes it's even a surprise to the author. I mean, I know that I plan my books out from start to finish before I start, but the only thing I'm not quite sure what I'm doing, where I'm going towards, is what the book means, and that's going to be a surprise to me.
Yeah, it's so many poets, not only fiction writers, of course, have written about baseball, but among them, the mentor of Elizabeth Bishop, who's been the subject of so much interest this weekend, Marianne Moore, and she wrote about baseball, and she said, baseball is like writing. You don't know what will happen. You don't know what will happen or what you will do. And I think that's exactly right. The fact is we don't know, and I think that's one of the reasons we're interested in the athletes, is because we feel that they're like us. There's a lot of serendipity with which they must cope, and they don't know. You don't know.
Yeah, and I would even say, I think the word formula is sort of when it's done badly, it reads like a formula, right?
Yeah,
but
well,
when
that's
it's
that.
done well, it's a tradition that you're drawing on, and you're choosing which pieces to use and misuse, and you muddy them up and you complicate them, and that's sort of why it's sort of the most hated phrase to me as a crime writer is transcend the genre, which is it's really, even though it's always meant as a compliment, there's something very annoying about it, because the genre doesn't have any value in and of itself. It's not a bad thing. But formula suggests that the reader, it's transparent to the reader that there's going to be no mystery, there's going to be no complication or ambiguity, that they're going to get exactly what they want. And I think none of us want to write those books, probably. But that makes me think too of the parallels. We talked a little bit about this, some of us before, between writing fiction and sports, because I do think there's some weird ones, and one of them is that if I had this strange experience where I ended up in an elevator recently with Kevin Garnett, the basketball player, who's in the new movie Uncut Gems. He is 3 times my height. We were in the same elevator, and I was wearing Converse shoes, and he looked at my shoes and he said, "Oh, I should have worn my Converse today." And he went back to his hotel room to change his shoes. And I thought, if there's anyone more suspicious than writers about their routines and rituals, it's athletes. And I wonder if there are any other parallels that you might see between the act of writing and the act of playing sports.
Well, Red Smith, who was my mentor, used to say that writing was easy. All you did was open up her wrist and let it drip out drop by drop. And I would say that a lot of athletes I've interviewed feel the same way about what they do. I think the identification and why it's so easy to involve readers in sports is because the gestures are things that we all did as kids. They just do it way better. We've all picked up a rock and thrown it. We've all picked up a stick and tried to hit something or run faster than the kid next door. And those elemental experiences are writ large on baseball fields and football fields and tennis courts and all those other places. And it gives you something transcendent. I mean, a sports medicine guy once said to me that the athletes, I asked him how come Mickey Mantle could, with bad knees, torn cartilage, torn ACL, could run across center field at Yankee Stadium and make an impossible catch to save Don Larson's World Series perfect game. And he said he's a neuromuscular genius. And there's a kind of level that they have. It's partly neurology, it's physiology, it's will, that we can only aspire to. And that, to me, is the stuff of great writing, whether it's fiction or not fiction.
Yes, and also these great athletes, they're geniuses in their bodies, but they're basically without language. So the writers, the sports writers and the other writers are sort of giving a narrative and providing a story. Boxing, for instance, is all about stories, and each boxing match is a story, and there are 2 characters, and often they're very interesting backgrounds. Without that, without knowing who they are and what they might represent, it becomes a sort of superficial spectacle without all the other ramifications.
Yeah, and there's so many parallels also between, the athletes and ourselves. Lionel touched on one which he sort of said, talked about a tennis player who's in danger of losing his maybe his or her love of tennis. Actually David Remnick wrote about that too. In one of his boxing books, he talked about, you kill the thing you love. And there is that danger in fiction as well. He said sometimes when we think about our careers and what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, I myself always remember the husband of a friend of mine, he shall go unnamed. But things did not go well for him as a writer. And so here's this guy who loved books. And by the end of his career, he could not walk into a bookstore.
Yeah.
And and I tell you, I heard that story and I thought, I tell you one thing, and that if I feel that things are just not going my way, and I am in danger of becoming this person, it is time to walk away from your computer, because the danger is there. So I think there's a lot of parallels like that, I think, between us and the athletes.
I think Joyce said something really interesting. I did some research about the inarticulateness of athletes. Partly now it's because you don't get access to them and they all have Twitter feeds and then they think they've said everything. But mostly they cannot articulate, frankly, what they do. And it turns out that when you learn, for example, to be Michael Jordan, most of what you need to know is in you by age 4. And they've discovered that if you try to articulate what it is that you're doing, you suck. I mean, literally.
That's because it doesn't have to do with words.
Right,
And
exactly.
most of all, it doesn't have to do with thinking, or rather, it has to do with a
Precisely.
different kind of thinking.
Yeah.
And the kind of thinking that we think of as thinking, if you will,
Right.
is a distraction. And in fact, if you do play any sports, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. You become, the worst thing you can do is become too conscious about what you're doing. I can mostly speak for tennis. But, there's this clamor in your head. Get your racket back. Keep your wrist cocked. Keep your eye on the ball. By the way, watch the ball is the only thing that ever works for me. The rest of it is noise. And that is your enemy. And when a sport is working, or when you're doing something physically, I guess it doesn't have to be a sport, but when you're doing something physically well, there is a confluence between mind and body, and there are no voices in your head. And it's a kind of silence, and it's a unity. And I think that the articulation that you're talking about, that athletes are not good at and probably shouldn't become good at, is one of the things that fiction writers are good for, just sitting there in their chairs. Because it's what we can contribute to the sport, the ability to describe it.
What about the zone, though? I think Jeff Dyer might have brought that up. Do you think that you do get to a writing place sometime where you're not actually thinking in your writing, and that's maybe closer?
Yeah, I would actually argue that even though we do work with words, so much of what makes our writing live is actually coming from an unconscious place. It's better not observed and better not described. So we can be describing the athlete, but should we be trying to describe our own process as we're describing the athlete, our work is very likely to die. I always remember what Dorothy Parker said. She said, the goose that laid the golden egg died looking up its crotch. Said, would you lay as well? Don't watch. And that's, I think, for fiction writers, it's a funny thing because I think that there's a stage in which you're just getting it out. And when I was in graduate school, we used to call, the school of writing barf and polish, So, but, first you barf. And the barfing part, you've got to suspend everything that you know about writing. You've just got to get, you've got to get every single critical, voice out of there. Your mother, your editor, everybody out. And then you have to come back with the more rational part. Maybe the rational part can sort of say, oh, yes, this character, this needs to be developed a little more. Wow, I don't know about that ending, blah, 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 blah. But the fact of the matter is we do have to preserve a place that's very much where we're doing something a lot like what the athletes are doing.
I think that's one reason that I can't stand teaching creative writing. And I will warn you also, I can't stand being asked about process
Yes.
at events like this. Not only do I consider the subject killingly dull, but that kind of self-consciousness is my enemy.
Yes.
And I don't want to think about process.
There's two kinds of memory, as many of you may know, explicit and implicit. And when an athlete or a writer is starting to plan something, it's very conscious. Or for example, when you learn to drive and you're told, and when you get to the intersection with 4 ways, put your foot on the brake. But after you've been driving for a long time, you don't have to remind yourself. So with athletes, and I think it's true of writers, the memory actually moves from one part of the brain to another. It goes from explicit to implicit. And when they've done tests where they've forced athletes to articulate what they were doing, and their results all go way down.
It just making me think too that this connects everything everyone's saying, which is the superstition. Going back to superstition, I don't know if some of you, I know I am one of those writers that doesn't like to talk about something I'm writing for just, I think the reasons you're saying. It will actually feels like it will destroy it, and I do think that's similar to sometimes athletes talking about how they throw that pitch. They will not be able to throw it if they articulate it, and that just feels very, very precarious. So I thought I know we want to get some time for questions, but I thought we would all at least sort of make a pitch for one of our favorite sports, novels, short stories, poems. I'll put in a quick pitch for Leonard Gardner's Fat City, which I think also came up in Jeff's speech. It's one of my favorites. And for movies, for me, it will always be Slapshot, the great hockey movie. If any of you have not seen it, it's excellent.
Out of the Red Smith's first collection of short stories. Actually, Shirley Jackson, who reviewed it, said they read like short stories. He subscribed to Hemingway's belief that writing should have 7/8 of it below the surface, 1/8 above, and that if you pick the right details, and I think this is true for fiction and nonfiction, if you pick the right details, you don't need to give the bottom of the iceberg. He said he learned this by interviewing a stripper in his first job in St. Louis, and he asked her about her success in undressing artistically, and she said, "Always keep your pants on. The boys will come back wanting for more."
You know, it's so hard with fiction, but you know, I think for a short story that's a little under-recognized, I will say, is, you know, the Hector Quesadilla story, Tika Ragusan Boyle. I will also say, just for if I can go in another category,
Yes.
In another category, I would sort of say for pieces, you know, nothing really beats Hub Fan's Big Kid Adieu, John Updike. I mean, this is just, you know.
Tell us a little about that.
And if I may go for a
Yeah.
poem, Gail Mazur's Baseball, which I did bring, and which is a favorite of Jane Levy's as well.
So I have a little list, and I agree about Leonard Gardner, Fat City. It's sort of like a really good short story that has been developed, and the characters are quite compelling. Tom Jones, Sonny Liston was a friend of mine, and he has a story called The Pugilist at Rest, which is a beautiful story. And Joseph O'Neill's Netherland, which is about cricket.
Oh, yeah.
And that was kind of a wonderful novel. Christopher Beha's novel, An Index of Self-Destructive Acts, is about baseball in a kind of ritualistic way that hasn't been published yet. But I think that will be an interesting addition to the sports novels. And then I was going to mention the wonderful movie, Raging Bull, Scorsese's, I think, his best movie, with Jake LaMotta. Of course, all these works are really about other things besides sports. Sports are sort of just in the foreground, I think.
Well, I have a terrible confession to make. Just this morning, idly preparing for this event, I put into Google best sports novels.
Probably not the only one on stage.
And I found a list of 50, and I hadn't read any of them. I mean, yeah, I think I read Bernard Malamud's The Natural a long time ago in graduate school, but all I can remember is the movie. What I did think of, though, was this is not a sports novel per se, but it does stand out in my mind. Ian McEwan has a scene in Saturday. It's a squash game, And I swear he describes just about every stroke in that game, which seems impossible. And I'm not sure it works, but I really admired the exercise. It may be only 10 pages, but it felt like 50. And it's, you know, it in some ways, it stands out for me because it may be failed sports writing, right? So maybe I'm not recommending to you, but I have a feeling that describing every stroke is not the way you write about a squash game.
Right, because presumably you want people to be able to read it that don't understand the sport. You know, I've read cricket novels that have still worked for me. That does seem like the real challenge. If you're so deeply a fan, can you ever write about it in a way that will let people access it? But we have to open up to questions now. So why don't we see who would like to ask a question of anybody or everybody up here?
I have one back here.
This isn't really a question, just an observation about something that Lionel said, that I think anytime you have, I mean, you also said that as a writer in a solitary pursuit that you can lose the thing you love, but I think anytime that you're involved in a performance-based way of making a living, like being a music performer, like a classical pianist or a dance performer or whatever, or sports, then you have the risk of losing that thing you love because of the intensity and the single-mindedness that you have to use to pursue it and the competition that's always behind you and around you.
And the capacity for failure, you know, which starts to overwhelm any enjoyment you might take in prospective success. And I think that's where we get into some parallels with what Gish was talking about, that one of the things that destroys the joy of writing is anxiety over writing badly.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing happens in sports.
And then in contrast, too, it's not performative because we can revise as long as we want to. It can take a year to write a short story, whereas the performance is just so pitiless. You have just a few minutes, you may be in an immediate competition with somebody, and it's just all over.
Well, I guess in sports and in writing, there is sort of a myth about how the earliest years are the best years. First book sometimes is often the best book, and then you're kind of fighting to get that back. And I think that that's something that occurs in sports a lot too. The lack of self-consciousness early on, and then when the more you gain and the more reviews you've gotten and experiences you've had with criticism and edits, that they can kind of pile on you in the same way that for athletes too.
My editor very helpfully once told me, she said, the bar goes up with every book.
Oh
I
no!
was like, oh, thanks a lot.
You guys probably remember the pitcher Steve Blass for the Pittsburgh Pirates, who suddenly couldn't throw the ball over the plate. It went everywhere else.
Yeah.
And I think he and another guy I wrote about a long time ago, that feeling that you could lose that ability, whether it's a writer or an athlete, that it can just go and you cannot get it back. You can't will it back. You can't shrink it back. There's nothing you can do. And I think we all live with that feeling.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you don't get credit for your own talent. And that means you don't really own it, and you don't even understand it.
Yeah.
And that means that it can be, just as it was given to you, it can be taken away.
And I want us to stop talking about that right now.
Yes. This is what I mean about writers and superstition. There is that, but turning it back to sports, what's the pitching phenomenon where where they can't pitch anymore? It's not called the fits. There's some term for it. The yips.
Oh, that's golf.
Yes.
Sorry,
but
that's golf.
it's also baseball because
You lose control.
Yes, yeah.
You lose your control.
Yes, there was a great memoir
Or
by a former
vocation,
pitcher.
as it is
Yeah.
now
Yeah,
called.
or in tennis, it's called choking.
Okay.
It's called choking in football. You know, anybody watch the game yesterday? Choking. Go.
Other questions or recommendations?
We have
yes.
one in the back here.
I was wondering, when you're writing about fiction about sports, do you have real life models in mind, or is that actually sometimes an obstacle to writing fictional characters?
When I was writing about women boxers, I had some actual historic boxers in mind, and others were composite figures. So I think that's probably what most of us do. There's a model you may modify, and then you have your own fictitious person, and sort of, because verisimilitude is sort of the main hope, I guess, of realistic fiction, that you have to create this world that seems real and is more or less is real, and then you put fictitious persons into that.
I availed myself of a real-life biography in the post-birthday world. There was a snooker player called Jimmy White, and he had, at that time, been in 6 different world finals and lost every single one. And in fact, the last one, if you know anything about the game, it came down to the final black, and it was a really easy shot. And he'd have finally got the title that he'd worked his whole life for, and he missed. Right? I love, see, that's the kind of drama. It's just fucking great. So I love that biography. However, I didn't want to use Jimmy White himself. If nothing else, he's paunchy and inarticulate, and I wanted a character who is really sexy.
In Squeeze Play, I had to make fake ball players. And so they were based on guys I had met, and there were combinations of them. The only one that was exactly verbatim true was the guy, Catherine Graham once asked me who was the most impressive athlete I had ever met in the locker room. And you can imagine what she was really asking. And the answer to that in the fiction is the Stick. And the Stick is Frank Robinson.
Oh, we got some dish. I have a book about a gymnast that is sort of a mix of Ali Reisman, and I read the memoir, Nadia Comaneci's memoir, which Letters from, to a Young Gymnast, which is, to me, a great novel. It's insane. Her voice is really powerful and relentless and very angry and fascinating, and so that definitely got into my brain. So, but they're usually a mix, right? It's never usually one-to-one. Other questions or picks?
Yeah, we have time for one more.
I have someone right here.
I haven't attended all the sessions, but most of them, and I'm a little surprised that no one has mentioned probably one of the greatest sports books ever written, and it's the 50th anniversary this year of Jim Bouton's Ball 4.
Well, that's not a novel, or we would have. Yes.
It is, but it was revolutionary for its time and its genre, and doing the season, pulling back the curtain, the politics and the economics of sport. And I think, and Mr. Bouton did die just recently at the end of last year.
Yes, I love that book. I want to hear from our baseball. That's one of my favorite books. And also, I thought of that with the keynote speech because he's also one of the few athletes that talks about all the books he reads so much, because so much of Ball 4 is about his reading habits, which I also love. It's a great one.
He was a wonderful guy, and he actually did write a significant amount, even though Leonard Schechter, a well-known sports writer, worked with him. And what's noteworthy about it is he used exactly the same structure that you were talking about. Baseball gives you a season. And if you take the season as the premise and you're going to fill in the dates, and frankly, that's what I did in Squeeze Play for exactly the same reason, it gives you a way to organize the experience. Jim's papers were just donated to the Library of Congress. They're going to be available for anybody. You can go look at the interviews he did and what his own notes and how much of the writing he did. And it was a seminal book, but so was Pete Gent, North Dallas 40, so was Dan Jenkins.
Semi-Tough.
Semi-Tough. All those books were ways of doing what we talked about yesterday, which is mythologically of them, whatever that word is. Thank you. Yes.
Do we have time, Gish? Do you want to read your poem?
Oh, could you?
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
I
Please,
did bring my
We'll
favorite
just take a minute,
poem,
yeah.
and it does touch on some of the things that we've been talking about, and certainly touches on why baseball, at least, matters so much. I will say that I'm not the first person to read this publicly, because Jane Leavy also read this same poem at Fenway Park.
No. Gail read it.
Oh, Gail read it.
Yeah, Gail read it.
Oh, I thought that you read it. Anyway, so this is Baseball by Gail Mazur. She'll be horrified because I'm going to edit it a little bit. But I think it does say something about sports and literature, and particularly baseball. So this is Gail Mazur. The game of baseball is not a metaphor, and I know it's not really life. The chalky green diamond, the lovely dusty brown lanes I see from airplanes multiplying around the cities are only neat playing fields. Their structure is not the frame of history carved out of forest. That is not what I see on my ascent. And down in the stadium, the veteran catcher guiding the young pitcher through the innings, the line of concentration between them, that delicate filament, is not like the way you are helping me. Only it reminds me, when I strain for analogy, the way that a rookie strains for perfection, and the veteran, in his wisdom, seems to promise it. It glows from his upheld glove. And the young wife trying to understand what a full count could be to please her husband, happy in his old dreams, or the little boy in the Yankees cap already nodding off to sleep against his father, program and popcorn memories sliding into the future, and the old woman from Lincoln, Maine, screaming at the Yankee slugger with wounded knees to break his leg. This is not a microcosm, not even a slice of life. And the terrible slumps when the greatest hitter mysteriously goes hitless for weeks, or the pitcher's stuff is all junk, who threw like a magician all last month, or the days when our guys look like Senate cops, slipping, bumping each other, then suddenly the play that wasn't humanly possible, the kid we know isn't ready for the big leagues, leaps into the air to catch a ball that should have gone downtown, and coming off the field is hugged and bottom slapped by the sudden sorcerers, the winning team. The question of what makes a man slump when his form, his eye, his power aren't to blame. This isn't like the bad luck that hounds us, and his frustration in the games, not like our deep rage for disappointing ourselves. The ballpark is an artifact, manicured, safe, seen in an Easter egg, and the order of the ball game, the firm structure, with the mystery of accidents always contained. It's not the wild field we wander in, where I'm trying to recite the rules, to repeat the statistics of the game, and the wind keeps carrying my words away.